Hello. The topic for today is this really nice article from Michael B. Gill called Agonizing Decisions and Moral Pluralism. And what it amounts to is an argument in favor of moral pluralism as opposed to moral monism. Gill starts off by referring to a film, an old film, I think 1952, if I remember right, called High Noon. It's a sort of classic of American cinema. As far as I know, it's not been remade, and I'm a little bit surprised at that. I think it's, it's a really outstanding story. It stars a fellow pictured here, Gary Cooper, as the marshal of a town named Hadleyville. It also stars Grace Kelly, who is so the character's name is Will Kane. It's his wife Amy, and in fact they get married in the first 5 minutes of the film. So it's they're brand newlyweds, and of course I would encourage you to go back and sort of see the film, just because not because you really need it in order to get the details of this article, but just because it's a good film, and I myself, I rewatched it a few days ago just because of out of I hadn't seen it in a while, and it's pretty good. It's better than I even had remembered. I'd remembered it being good. The soundtrack's a bit cheeseball, but the acting's generally good. The writing's good. It's a great story. So anyway. At the beginning of the film, you see that Will and Amy are getting married, and you sort of see some backstory unfold where apparently the deal is that Amy Kane is a Quaker, which means she's a pacifist. Okay, that's she's completely categorically opposed in every way to violence. And so that would be a little awkward, her being married to the marshal of the town, who may in fact have to use violence in the course of his duties. And so the idea is that she only agrees to marry him because he agrees to essentially retire from being the marshal. And so they get married basically on his last day on the job. He turns in his gun and his star, and they're about to go off, and he's going to run a store somewhere or something. Right? That's the plan. Well, that very day, the news comes in that a great villain that Will Kane had put away some number of years ago for murder had been pardoned. And there's no real detail how that happened, or what strings were pulled or what. But he gets pardoned and is apparently going to be arriving in town on the noon train, right? Hence the film High Noon. The whole film actually takes place almost in real time. It's really really incredible. It's very very well shot. You very much get the sense that the clock is ticking this whole time. And in any case, there's three of his sort of known associates, the known associates of this villain, one of whom actually is played by a very young Lee Van Cleef, who will grow to be one of the very best Western villain actor of all time, without question. But he plays something of a bit part in this film. And so in any case, there are these three known associates of I believe it's Frank Miller, I think is the guy's name, who's he's going to come. They're coming after Will, right? That's exactly what's happening. And so everybody wants Will to get out of town, but Will is concerned that if he just leaves town, he's going to leave all these folks to be terrorized by by Miller and all these other gangsters essentially. And they won't have their new marshal until tomorrow. And so he says, look, I'm still the marshal today. This is still my job. This is still my town. I'm morally duty bound to stand up for this place. And so he goes about trying to raise a posse, and for one reason and another, nobody will join him to help defend the town, and so basically he does it himself. Amy wants him to leave. She in fact gets onto that noon train that Miller gets off of, intending to leave. Right? She says, look, I'm done with this whole violence thing. The guns gotta go. That's not the life for me. And it's a tough decision on all hands. Well, it turns out that once she starts to hear the gunfire, she sort of gets off the train right before it takes off, and runs back to the town. I'm not sure what she's going to do, or what sort of plans she had made. And by this point, Will has killed two of the baddies. There is a total of four, and he ends up it looks like he's kind of cornered by the remaining two. and then Amy having sort of picked up a gun that she sees from one of the villains that's down, ends up shooting one of them in the back, and sort of allowing Will to win, and carry the day. Uh, and so it's a tough thing for her. And you again, as Gil points out, you see her face very briefly, but there's this kind of agony on it. I think Grace Kelly as an actress does a really excellent job there. Again, the shot's very brief, but I think pretty effective. And at the end of all this, with these villains all lying down, and Kane essentially having stood all by himself to defend the town that nobody else would bother to defend, very dramatically at the end of the film, takes his star, throws it on the ground in disgust, and leaves. It's a great film. So anyway, the focus of this particular article is on Amy's actions, right? Her decision to kill a man. And the kind of agony, the sort of agonizing decision that this must have represented for her. So using this example, Gill proposes what he considers to be these elements of what he considers an agonizing moral decision. And those elements are, first off, that it should involve agent regret, okay, as opposed to bystander or situation regret. It is not just that what Amy regrets is that there was this unfortunate situation that that she was involved in, right? That's not it, right? And it's not just that she was sort of watched this thing happen and was like, boy, I wish that thing hadn't happened, right? It's neither of those two things. It's that she herself regrets a thing that she did, right? You imagine she regrets killing a man even if she thought it was the right thing to do. And that's, of course, our second element of an agonizing decision is that the agent should have no real wish to undo what they did, right? They should regret it, but don't wish to undo it, right? And we can imagine in this kind of a case, Amy may well feel that way. She has no wish to undo her action, but clearly, right, would regret it. The third element of an agonizing decision is that the kind of bad feeling, the source of the regret is a kind of moral agony, as opposed to sort of squeamishness or mere disgust. It's not that she thought, oh, the blood in the guts was gross or off-putting, or that wasn't that kind of squeamishness, right? Perhaps somebody might like have to squish a really giant spider and it's just really gross, right? But and they sort of regret doing it because it was gross, right? Not because they had some moral problem with doing it. No, in this case, Amy has to have a kind of moral agony here. Her regret has a moral root, right? She thinks that she's done something bad, right? She's killed a man, even again, if she doesn't wish to undo the act. And finally, it has to be a kind of appropriate remorse, right? That has to be the idea here. And again, in Amy's case, we can see that this criterion is fulfilled. I think anybody should say, well, look, even if she may have ultimately done, a right act, or she may have done sort of, her duty, or she may have acted appropriately, I think we would all grant that it would be perfectly okay for somebody, in fact, appropriate for somebody to feel remorse at having killed somebody else, whatever the circumstances. And so again, the remorse has to be sort of appropriate. And so when you look at each of these four elements, you have what the makings of what Gill is going to call, for his purposes, an agonizing decision, right? And I think it should be clear this is an agonizing moral decision. Many decisions could be agonizing for other reasons. This is one that is agonizing for moral reasons. And so now that he's set out this kind of an act, right, he wants to say, okay, what are we supposed to make of this, right? What importance does a case like this one have for our thinking about morality? And his argument is that there are such cases, right? That's the basis of the argument. Is he thinks there are real cases of agonizing moral decisions, that there are plenty of real cases that people face every day that fit all of those four criteria. And he thinks that the best way to explain the very existence of such agonizing moral decisions is that pluralism is probably is that people tend to approach morality in a pluralistic way, right? That pluralism is just plausible. It has good intuitive sense to us. as opposed to monism. He thinks that monism doesn't make sense out of agonizing moral decisions, whereas pluralism does. And so that's effectively his agonizing decisions argument, right? He says if there are agonizing moral decisions, and if pluralism can explain the existence of those decisions much better than monism can, well, then that's a point in favor of moral pluralism. And that's essentially his reasoning here. This is a quote from the text. He says, "The pluralist claims that the best explanation of these thoughts is that common sense takes there to be a plurality of potentially conflicting basic moral ends." Okay. And so think about this for a second. The monist is not very well able to consider. So, for example, consider utilitarianism as a stand-in for one kind of moral monism. The utilitarian is going to say, okay, well, look, what out of all the actions available to Amy has the best overall consequences? And you feel like if she, sort of ran through something like that in her head and then, did her action, if she was doing what she thought had the best overall consequences, and if she thought that that's all that really mattered, then what would be the point of the regret? Where would the regret come from? Right? Why would the decision be agonizing? Right? If you think there's pretty much only one thing that's important and you follow that one thing, what's there to regret? Right? And so all monist theories seem to have this kind of a trouble, right? That they can't really explain the kind of agent regret that's appropriately felt and that comes with no wish to undo what one has done. It doesn't seem like monist theories explain agonizing decisions nearly as well, while pluralist theories seem to have a much better explanation in that, look, if there's just more than one thing that really is your duty, and you simply can't do both at the same time, it makes sense to feel pretty bad about the duty that you end up violating, even if you had to violate it for some other duty. So that's basically the story here. So Gill himself considers several replies to the agonizing decisions argument. And whether they're the best of all possible replies, I don't know. I think they're all reasonable. And I think that his answers to those replies really flesh out his argument very well. So I think he does a very good job here. And so the replies to the agonizing decisions argument that Gill considers, he considers the uncertainty objection. And that's the idea that perhaps what's going on is not that we feel that there's more than one, legitimate moral goal here. It's that there is one legitimate moral goal. We're just uncertain which of our available actions actually furthers that goal, right? So that may be a possibility. That may be a place for the regret to come from, is from uncertainty rather than from, moral pluralism. Also, he thinks that perhaps people could describe cases of having this kind of remorse, but without any kind of moral conflict, without any kind of conflict of duties, right? So the idea is you could have a kind of remorse, or a kind of moral agony, as in Gill's terminology, without necessarily having a conflict of duties, right? If that's possible, then this may not be an objection against monism. And finally, the last response may be that, look, how much are we really supposed to learn about morality from like really unusual cases? And I think this is where his response to this one, I think, is really where the article shines. Okay, so let's take a look at these objections in turn. So the uncertainty objection goes something like this, okay? So the question that the objector raises is, oh, look, couldn't the agony that is felt in a situation like Amy Kane's be the result of uncertainty rather than of moral pluralism, right? Could it be the case that instead of having more than one legitimate moral goal, a person might think that there really is only one moral goal, for example, to bring about the best overall consequences, like a utilitarian, but it's just really uncertain as to which of their actions will actually do that. They just don't know. And that's why they always have these regrets. They're like, well, gosh, if I would have done this, would that have been better? Gosh, if I'd done that, would that have been better? And you might imagine somebody really beating themselves up, and that sounds pretty normal. And it doesn't require that you give up moral monism in order to have this kind of agonizing decision. So that's the flavor of the response. It says you can have an agonizing moral decision without having to adopt a morally pluralistic worldview. If all this agony comes from uncertainty rather than from actually being sort of pulled in more than one direction by morality itself. Okay. Well, so to counter this, Gill brings in a very commonly used example. It's a very much discussed example, and it was first brought up by Jean-Paul Sartre in an article he wrote in 1956 called "Existentialism is a Humanism." And like I said, lots of people have used this example for lots of different things, but here's what the example is. So Sartre tells of a student that he once had, right? And he says the student lived alone with his mother in France during World War II. His mother was ill and dependent on the student both materially and emotionally. The boy's father had collaborated with the Germans, and the boy's older brother had been killed in the German offensive of 1940. The student was thus faced with the choice of leaving for England to join the Free French forces, that is, to fight the Germans, or of remaining with his mother and helping her to carry on. What should he have done? And so this is one of those, the reason that Gill brings this case up is because he thinks it's a case that will answer the uncertainty objection, right? So you might imagine that in the moment where this student is trying to decide what to do, that he's trying to decide, again, perhaps he's trying to decide which choice has the best overall consequences, perhaps, right? Or perhaps he's trying to decide, what his ultimate duty is, right? If there's sort of one ultimate moral duty, much in the style of Kant or something like that. So this looks like a case where uncertainty, right, could play a rather large role. But just imagine that the student decides to go ahead and join the Free French forces, right? And he ends up playing an absolutely pivotal role in the liberation of France and the winning of the war in Europe, right? Just by any objective measure, he played a perfectly pivotal role. And so at this point, right, in this sort of hypothetical situation, the uncertainty about the case is totally resolved, right? There's no uncertainty anymore. Right? Had he stayed home, it's possible, let's say it's very possible France simply wouldn't have been liberated, right? So the Germans might have won, might have held out, or something like that, or certainly may have held on years longer, if this particular student hadn't joined the Free French forces and done some very important set of things, right? But the idea is that, imagine whatever you like about the case. The point is that we can imagine a case where his uncertainty about his decision in terms of perhaps the overall consequences or perhaps his ultimate duty are resolved, right? He's no longer uncertain about what's going to happen because he knows what happened. But don't you think he might still regret leaving his mother? Right? Even though he knows, right, that there might be some, he did the thing that had the best overall consequences. Don't you think he would regret leaving his mother? And again, that seems to indicate this pluralist view that there really are just more than one legitimate moral end, and that even that abandoning one of those legitimate moral ends, even to follow another, can be agonizing, right? That it seems like the pluralist has a pretty good response to this. So the response is that we can imagine many cases where the uncertainty is resolved and yet the agony still persists. So the agony cannot simply be a result of uncertainty. Right. All right, so the second objection I wanted to take a look at here is one where the objector says, well, look, can't we imagine some cases where somebody might have this kind of moral agony or this kind of regret without any case of moral conflict or conflicts between different legitimate moral ends? And so the question is, does remorse, have to mean that there is a basic moral conflict here? Can't you have remorse without a basic moral conflict? And so the objector would supply an example like this one, would say, so we'll look, consider unlucky Bill. This is actually an article from, this example I think originally was proposed as in an article by Bernard Williams about moral luck, if I remember right. But it's been used again by many folks, and I think a couple of those folks are cited by Gill. And so anyway, Bill is driving safely, and through no fault of his own, he runs over a young sledder who has slid quickly and unexpectedly into the road, right? Bill appropriately experiences remorse, even though he has himself done nothing wrong. Okay, so this appears to be a case where there's remorse, but no real moral conflict. Well, I think the reply to this one is actually pretty easy. And if you sort of, go back 5 seconds, pause things before reading this slide, you could probably come up with it yourself. the idea is this. I mean, just consider all the differences between the cases like Amy Kane's and cases of Unlucky Bill, right? There's just a lot different here. Bill does not have any of the, certainly not most of the hallmarks of an agonizing moral decision. So remember, Amy Kane has done what she has done intentionally, right? She did the thing, she did it on purpose. She killed someone on purpose, okay? She also has no desire to undo the act. And also her regret is specifically moral. Okay, she thinks she has done the wrong thing, and we also think her regret is appropriate. Okay, and so that, again, that's what qualifies her case as a case of an agonizing moral decision. Now consider Unlucky Bill. Bill has not acted intentionally, right? Did not intentionally run over this letter. He absolutely would desire to undo the act, right? Who wouldn't? And of course, he cannot have moral regret, right? The regret can't be specifically moral because, of course, he has done nothing wrong. There's nothing for him to regret, morally speaking. And so moral regret would also be inappropriately felt if he did feel that. In fact, he has made no decision at all. Okay? And so cases like Unlucky Bill's aren't going to play against Gill's agonizing moral decision because it just doesn't have any of the features of an agonizing moral decision. Sure, there might be things that a person would regret without having to, bring morality into the thing, but that's not the case. Gill's argument has to do with agonizing decisions. Okay, and certainly Unlucky Bill's case doesn't count as an agonizing decision. It doesn't even count as a decision. Okay, so this one is fairly easily swept away. Finally, the third objection that Gill deals with is the objection about unusual cases. Okay, and the proposal is this: we say, okay, look, take cases like Amy Kane's, right, from this a fictional movie, for goodness sakes, right, or Sartre's Student, which may well have been fictionalized, who knows. But the idea is that even if somebody faced, like some real person faced one of these kinds of situations, this sort of situation is so rare, so unusual, right? So far out of the realm of ordinary experience that what do we want to say we really learn about morality from these kinds of cases, right? That's the unusual cases objection, is to say we can't use cases that are this unusual to tell us something about morality, which is something we deal with on a daily, hourly basis. Right? And that's totally fair. We don't generally want to learn from our unusual cases as much as from the more usual ones. Well, Gill's response is twofold here. His first response is to say, okay, that's fair enough, okay? But we can imagine much, much more ordinary cases of agonizing moral decisions than Amy Kane's case or the case of Sartre's Student, right? And so he presents the case of Barron's Wife, which is a case that was proposed by Marcia Barron in an article called Remorse and Agent Regret, right? And so he's going to reuse the example here. The example is as follows. A woman is in a marriage she finds stultifying, right? That's a fancy word for boring. She believes that if she leaves her husband, she will be able to grow more as a person, but she is aware that leaving will sever the significant emotional bond she still has with her husband, and that he is likely to suffer pain and depression as a result. Should she stay or should she go? Right? This looks like a very ordinary case. I think this is the kind of thing that somebody might deal with every day, right? This is again completely ordinary when compared certainly with Kane's example or Sartre's Student. But does it count as an agonizing decision? Right? Remember the 4 criteria. Okay, so imagine she decides to stay or decides to go, either one. Okay, you might say that either way she's doing something and doing it intentionally, and so if she experiences regret, it'll be agent regret, satisfying condition 1. Right? Condition 2 would be sort of no wish to undo the act, right? And we can stipulate that. We might imagine somebody might decide to leave their spouse and then not and regret doing so even if they don't wish to undo the action, right? The third right criterion is going to be that the result the regret is moral regret, right? And so again, in this case, you might say, well, look, I've harmed somebody, right, emotionally, right? I've done some harm to them, and I totally regret that, even if I think it was the right decision for me, right? I mean, that again, that sounds like specifically moral regret. And then finally, we would find that to be regret to be appropriate. That's that. Remember that last criteria. And again, say somebody leaves their spouse and causes them real emotional harm. Um, we might imagine they would regret that decision because they would regret doing this harm to somebody else, even if they didn't wish to undo what they had done. And it's specifically moral regret, and we think they probably should regret doing harm to somebody. Same thing could happen if she decides to stay, right? She might decide to stay in the marriage, but really regret not doing, regret staying, even though she doesn't really wish to undo the act, and have these regrets that are specifically moral, right? She thinks she's sort of failed in a duty toward herself. And we think that might be appropriate, right, to feel regret at having failed such a duty. So again, a very standard case, very normal, and yet it fits all the features of an agonizing moral decision. So that's the first way that Gill decides to respond to this unusual cases objection, is to say, well, look, we can think of plenty of usual cases. The second, and I think a more thoroughgoing response to this unusual cases argument, is to say, well, let's consider even a completely different kind of case, okay? And so it's at this point that Gill wishes to turn away from these kinds of stark, forced choices, okay? So like Amy Kane is in a very stark, forced choice. She either pulls that trigger or she doesn't, and has to deal pretty immediately with some pretty serious consequences either way, right? That's a very stark choice. Sartre's student, right, has to either stay or go, and he's gotta be quick about it, right? That's it's a stark choice. And the same thing even with Baron's spouse. Got to do something, and it's again, stay or go, stark forced choice. So we certainly have those, right? Those are certainly a thing, but they're not the only kinds of moral decisions that people make. And so it's at this point that Gill wants to look at what he thinks is a much more common kind of experience in making moral decisions. And in order to sort of explain what he means, he uses this concept of a moral design problem, and credits, I believe he credits Honora O'Neill with the really great ethicist with this central insight, but he deploys it very, very well here. And he says this, so just imagine an example like this. So imagine you're an architect, right? Because we want to know what a design problem is before we start talking about what a moral design problem is. And so an architect would have something like a design problem, and this is how it looks. So imagine your client wants a building, right? And they want that building to be beautiful, right? They want it to look good. They want it to be sustainable, right? They want, like sort of low energy cost, low environmental impact, all that sort of stuff. They want a green building in this sense, right? And they want it to be cheap, right? As cheap as you can get it, because they're not made of money. And so when you look at these sorts of things, all these goals, right? All these desires in this client, I think immediately you want to say there seems to be a couple of obviously wrong ways to go about responding to this kind of design problem. So it seems wrong to just pick one of those things and maximize it and just ignore the other ones, right? And it seems pretty clear also that increasing one of these things, making the building more beautiful or more sustainable or cheaper, is going to trade off against at least some of those other things. So let's take a look at, for example, just a few examples, because why not? So this here is the Walt Disney Concert Hall. You can sort of see that there. It was designed by an architect named Frank Gehry, and it's beautiful, right? And it's pretty expensive, but it's also like this kind of sweeping, lots of angles, lots of curves, right? I mean, Gehry is very well known for not liking a lot of straight lines, or in some cases even any straight lines in the stuff that he designs. But it's also fairly wasteful of materials, right? Notice the interior volumes aren't as efficient as they could be, right? And so in terms of sustainability, it really takes a big hit, even though it's very beautiful. Again, the beauty in this case trades off against both cost, it's expensive to build this way, and it's somewhat wasteful of material to build this way, but it is very beautiful. Another example we can see, this is the Braj al Bait, Again, another really stunningly beautiful building. It's in Saudi Arabia. It's a biggest, I think it's the biggest clock tower in the world. Certainly the biggest clock face. And you think I think if you could look online for like comparisons between this and like Big Ben, the famous London clock tower, and this thing dwarfs Big Ben, right? Uh, and notice that big crescent on the top there, that's actually, it's a fiberglass shell, but it's covered in real actual gold. Okay. This building here, despite, again, is very beautiful, but it is the most expensive building in the world. It costs something like $15 billion. And a lot of that is the amount of like gold used in its construction. So again, really beautiful. But we blow the crap out of the whole cost effectiveness feature in a building like this. Uh, Once we start saying, okay, maybe let's really start looking at making architecture sustainable. I mean, so here's I don't actually know where this is. I just sort of found this picture. And this is, we might say, hey, these are green buildings in more than one sense. And maybe you sort of like the look of this. Maybe you think it's pretty ugly. I don't know. I think it's probably a love it or hate it kind of thing. But in any case, just think about, like putting all this greenery up on the outside of a building and putting it that high up off the ground. It has some real challenges, right? In the sense that all that stuff is very, very heavy, right? Like the dirt, the water, right? And of course, it's not static, right? All these things, they grow, they die, in terms of maintenance costs, there's a lot of challenges here. And so this gets very, very expensive, and I'll sort of leave the judgment about its aesthetics up to you. But if you want to do some sustainable design, for example, much more cheaply, we see this photo here, like the building on the left that looks like just a big rectangle surrounded by cables of some kind. I don't know, to me, it's sort of stunningly ugly. And especially when you sort of contrast it in the photo with this sort of very beautiful, sort of Gothic style tower. The sustainable construction can be pretty ugly if that's if that's the primary thing you're going for. So you can go like full on sustainable and sort of blow the cost out of the water, or else really make a pretty ugly building, because some of the things that make buildings environmentally friendly also sort of make them ugly. And it's a challenge for designers. It certainly doesn't have to be that way, but it's a challenge for designers to sort of do the best they can. But of course, if you want the cheapest of possible buildings, this is a Wesco Hall on the campus of the University of Kansas, and it's just a big concrete bunker of a building, right? Just big square concrete. It's really horrible. I spent a good many years with working in this building back in the day. Uh, a number of years ago, the University Daily Kansan, the KU student newspaper, reported sort of tongue-in-cheek that this building had been named to the National Registry of Eyesores and Monstrosities, along with the Los Angeles County landfill. It's sort of fitting. Actually, true story. My very first day in Lawrence, Kansas, when I moved there to go to graduate school at the University of Kansas, we unloaded the truck, and then the very next morning I sort of got up and walked to a very nearby grocery store and got a few supplies, something to eat, and then grabbed a newspaper because I'm like, hey, I'm in Lawrence, I'll grab a Lawrence newspaper. And the front page story was about a number of people who had been diagnosed with brain tumors, who had spent long years working in Wesco Hall, and they had some suspicions that perhaps something about the building had been, sort of causing brain tumors. And they were sort of starting an investigation. I'm like, oh, great, I think that's the building I'm in. As it turns out, it was simply a statistical coincidence. They tested the air, they tested the water, they tested all kinds of things for known carcinogens, and it's just one of those things that happens sometimes. You'll see a cluster of cases, and absent some other feature that you can really say that explains it, then it's just a coincidence. And it really was a coincidence. There hasn't been a continued spike of brain tumors among people who work in Wesco Hall. Just people who think that the building is ugly and whatever that causes. Because it is ugly, and part of the reason it's as ugly as it is because they sort of cut a lot of costs in its construction. So there you go. You can make a real cheap building, but it's going to be ugly, and it's not particularly environmentally friendly. In fact, there's all kinds of stuff that's had to be done with this building to sort of bring it up to make it just even a usable building, honestly. And so aside from these architecture examples, where I think we clearly see what a design problem looks like, right? Where the idea is that there's more than one thing that are legitimately good. Look, it's legitimately good for a building to be beautiful. It's legitimately good for a building to be sustainable, and it is legitimately good for a building to be cost effective, right? Especially if for the person who has to pay for building it, all right? So all of those things are honestly good things that you should want any building to be. It's just you can't do them all at the same time, right? Any progress in one tends to trade off against progress on the other, and the better the design job you do, the more of those things you can juggle, but you can't get everything you want. You can't make the most beautiful, most sustainable building that ever existed for nothing, right? It's just not going to happen. And you're not going to make a really cheap building that is really pretty and really sustainable, and and to some degree, beauty and sustainability can sometimes trade off against one another, right? That's just reality for you. And so Gill thinks that this is kind of what morality is like in our ordinary experience, right? If we're talking about the most usual cases. And so he gives us something that is a very kind of usual case. He calls it the busy day. And this is an example of a moral design problem, right? And so again, this is a quote from the text. He says, "To see this, consider the busy day. A situation in which a person on one particular day has powerful reasons, again, say moral reasons, to spend as much time as possible with her family, and has powerful moral reasons to spend as much time as possible at work, and has powerful moral reasons to spend as much time as possible with a particular friend." Okay. Well, guess what? You can't do all three of those, and because we're dealing with time in each case, that time itself is not infinite and trades off. When you spend more in one place, you have to spend less in another. That's a very usual kind of a case. And so these kinds of cases, Gill says, are going to really provide support for his argument that this kind of the way that we think about morality tends to be pluralist rather than monist. He says that these kinds of moral design problems provide support for pluralism over monism because they reflect common features of moral experience, right? And these common features that he might point out are that, number one, there's more than one way to further legitimate moral ends. Right, when you're dealing with a design problem, look, there's more than one way to design a building, right, that is going to juggle, right, all of the kinds of things that are valuable. There's radically different even ways of designing a building that can do that. There's also more than one way to go about living that busy day, right, and sometimes even radically different ways of going about living that busy day that still manage to fulfill some reasonable, legitimate moral ends. Also, he thinks that this is the idea there are actually just multiple legitimate moral ends that apply to us. We have duties to ourselves, we have duties to our employers, we have duties to our families, we have duties to our friends, and that these things can simply trade off against one another, right? They can't perhaps all be accomplished. And it rarely seems right then to sort of completely abandon some moral ends to maximize some other one. And he thinks this is the mistake that the monists make, right? Is that they tend to focus overly on one particular kind of a moral end and then sort of abandon all others. And we can see that in some of the cases that tend to be the very most difficult for morally monist theories. For very rule-based theories like Kant's, we see that a case where we're following the rules or respecting people's rights, in other words, has really bad consequences. Sort of maximizes rights and gives up consequences. Whereas the utilitarian, we've seen in any number of cases where maximizing the best overall consequences can give up on this idea of sort of rights or justice. And so it seems like they've sort of gone all in toward one legitimate moral end, but then left another behind. Whereas Gill thinks both of these things are legitimate moral ends, and you might have cases where you have to choose between rights and consequences, and those cases are cases of, I think, agonizing moral decisions. And the fact that we can regret whatever we do, even without wishing to undo it, and have that regret be very appropriately felt, et cetera, just indicates that our common sense thinks of morality more in pluralistic terms than in monistic terms.